Welcome back to the Board Drill Podcast. As usual, I'm your co-host, Kyle Bradburn. I'm here with my other co-host, Matt Dixon. And tonight we welcome Aaron Avery, the OC at the Bolles School. Coach Avery, welcome to the Board Drill Podcast. We're excited to have you on tonight.
Glad to be here, bud.
You sound really pumped, considering that you are the reason, or at least half of the reason why we're here. The idea of this podcast came up when you and I were carpooling for several years to Oakleaf High School. And finally, 2 years later, when I had nothing better to do, we made it happen. So welcome onto the podcast. We're excited to have you tonight. We're going to talk about approaching the off-season study, what kind of analytics we do, how we get better, learning methods, and all of the good stuff that's wrapped up in that. So Coach Avery, obviously we're going to start off with you. You're just coming off, unfortunately, congrats on making the Final Four. Unfortunately, you guys, you lost, and we're now about, yeah, I know, right? Sorry, I just pointed out you lost. Now we're about a week out, and Matt's going to laugh at me. Are we going to have to start this over again?
It's all right. Last year, my daughter said, a couple weeks later, she brought up to me, she's like, "Hey, Dad, are you still upset you guys lost?" I was like, "It wasn't until that."
I kind of just dropped it. You lost. You lost.
Listen, guys, it's he still works for Bolles, so I got to get my cracks in there. But no, honestly, making the Final Four is a big deal. Obviously, you guys, Final Four, you have to go down to Miami and play a Norland High School, which is ridiculously talented. So, a tough game. You guys went down there, you held your own. Like you said, we talked about it. You guys had spots that you felt that you could make some plays, and ultimately, it just wasn't your night. So we're a week later. We're on Thursday. What are we? Wednesday night here. Where are you headed now with your off-season scout? Like, what do you even start with going into the off-season?
Yeah, so kind of the first thing once I get back in football mode is jumping into Huddle and then starting to just clean up all the tagging and making sure, everything's kind of tagged the way it should be. This season I kind of fell behind on some post-game tagging that I'm catching up on now, and then just trying to make sure that everything that I might want filled out is filled out. And Huddle does some things weird in terms of how you got to tag things, and so just kind of going back through and cleaning some of that up just to kind of make it consistent for us for the entire season.
So basically, just to kind of wrap that up, you're going through game by game, you're inputting, play calls and things like that. Is it specifically just offense? Do you go back and tag any part of the defense or anything like that in your self-scout at the end of the year? Or is it just, it's about Bolles?
Yeah, so it's about Bolles, so I go back through and I just create a full playlist from the whole season, and so I got every offensive clip from the whole season in one playlist. But it's trying to make sure everything is tagged, and then the way I tag it is I break everything down into its own column. Every piece of the play call is in its own column. So that way, when we want to go back and look at things, we can look at things very, very specifically, or we can go back and, still see things very broadly in terms of whatever it is that we're trying to look at.
So can you go a little more in depth on that? Maybe, I know you call it different at Bolles that you did at Oakleaf. Like, what would be an example of maybe an old call at Oakleaf? And then how do you specifically break it down? You said every piece of it. So can you go through like exactly what that means?
So just, for example, like formation, right? Like I won't tag the formation right or left into the formation. Like formation direction has its own column. For us, the varying ways we might block zone kind of has its own column.
Okay.
If we have an RPO tagged, it's got its own column. Protection's got its own column. Motions have their own column. Shifts have their own column. And so we just try to break it down. So if I want to just look at one specific RPO tag, I can pull it up, independent of whatever the run scheme might be. If I want to look at just one run scheme, I can pull it up. If I want to pull up, just one formation, just a single tag, formation tags are their own column as well. And so just trying to break it so each piece of information is in its own column. So if I need to go and look at something super specific, I can find it pretty easily. I don't have to sort it and and find, hey, this was Trey right, with this formation tag. I can just hit in Trey, and then all the rights and lefts are already pulled up.
Yeah. And for those of you that are out there, and not saying you're new to coaching, but if you use Huddle, it's really important to do exactly what Coach Avery's saying. As little as like the right and left with the formations, if you don't have your own like formation strength in Huddle, so if you're not like right in its own column and then maybe Trey or something like that, it can actually screw up your reports as well. And then you have to go back and really filter things. So I'm with you, Coach. I think it's super important to get really granular. That way you can look at the big picture, but then when I really want to get down to the nitty gritty, I can, because you can always get more big picture, but it's hard to get more granular. And that's always a tough thing. And, it's one of those things like, right, if I do this, I can do that. But if I do that, I can't do this. So you got to make sure not to do that.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead, Coach.
Coach, you talked about making a master basic playlist for all of offense. Do you ever break that down into smaller chunks to narrow your focus in the off season?
Yeah. So what we'll typically do is so right now, like I'm cycling through the full 23 offensive playlist. Then I'll break that down into the regular season games. We'll separate the postseason kind of as its own deal as well. But from a big picture, I try to keep the big picture as big as I can on that playlist.
So, all right, we got it. We cleaned up everything in Huddle. What's your next step? Because I know you've kind of tipped your hat to me and sent me this glorious looking sheet. So I'm really interested to hear this whole breakdown on what you do with this sheet.
Yeah. So once I get all the data, I'll go through and I'll export it out into Google Sheets. And then from there, I do a couple things. The first thing I do, and most of this stuff I got from other people combining, various kind of theories, and it's not even from like analytic people. It's just from people that make sense, the Feed the Cats guys, some of the things they talk about. But what I'll do is I'll put all the data in a Google Sheet. And then the first thing I do, and I got this at, I think, AFCA a couple years ago, is I remove all of the plays from once like the game's kind of under control. And so like I wouldn't say that, but once the game's in hand, all those play calls I take out. That way they don't skew anything. Because you've got that game where like, look, game's in hand. We're gonna run power the rest of the game. It is what it is.
Matt, he said the magic word.
And so I remove those plays just to try not to skew the data. And then once I've got that list made, then I start organizing, what I'm going to be looking for. I start combining some things to make it make sense. And then like I kind of start getting, working on all the formulas and trying to make it work. So what I'll do is I will share a sheet. This is from a couple years ago. You got it?
Yeah, it's right here on our screen.
So this is an example of kind of the sheet. And so again, kind of you can see here, and this terminology is old, but you can see here, personnel, formation strength, like they're all broken up into their own column. And then you can see, as I scroll down here, like it's only 500, 516 or 515. So that's not even all the plays from the year, because we play with a little bit of tempo. And so
that may be like 3 games worth, Coach.
Yeah, so that's not all of them. And so once I kind of have it all there, then I'll start getting over to the side and I'll start working on what is it that I want to find, color coding it so it's easy to see. And so what I got in this, again, nothing I invented, but from the Feed the Cats guys, right? Like minimum effective dose. Okay. And so what ended up being our top play calls. And so it worked out for us where I kind of came up with the top 10, and I came up with these not from like anything other than strictly like the amount of time they were called. Right. And so I looked at how many different calls we made in the year. All right. The top 20%. okay, ended up being in 10 plays. And so then
Wow.
how many times were they called? How many yards total did they get? Yards per call, the percent, all right, what total percentage of all the calls was that call? And then what percent of the total yards on the season was that call? And so kind of once I got it here, I mean, the first thing, and again, like this is kind of old terminology, but for us, this is inside zone, power, zone insert, counter, pin and pull, deep choice, power, and then a outside receiver, tunnel screen. So the first thing just looking at that was, okay, hey, look, yeah, I would consider those kind of the core, most of those core parts of what we do offensively. And then the one thing I kind of liked is just seeing like, all right, did it match up? The percent of times it was called versus the percentage of yards, right? Like if they're all close, then that means, it's probably about where it should be offensively. And so, we called inside zone almost 25% of our play calls. Well, it was almost 25% of our total yards, right?
Yeah, wow.
And then breaking it down, like how many yards do we get per call? And so I think, most coordinators would say, hey, look, if I can get over 6 yards every time I call inside zone and power and, pin and pull and all these run plays, then you'd feel really good about it.
So, Coach, real quick, not to interrupt you too much, but
yeah.
When you talk about the difference between percent called and the percent of yards, where is it where the break is too big and you say, hey, we need to change something, or hey, we need to look at this? Like, I see most of them are pretty tight, but some of them are 2 and 3 percentage points away. Where do you feel like that threshold is where you're like, oh, we need to either call this more or call it less?
So the first thing that kind of stuck out to me is like, look, you are who you are. And so, I mean, this year for this particular season that we're looking at, which again, it's a couple years old, like we were a versions of inside zone, deep choice, RPO, like that's who we were. And so seeing that, you're talking about 25%, I mean, you're talking almost 50% of our play calls, slightly less, were either versions of inside zone or versions of deep choice. And so like, look, that's who we are. Like I'm okay with those kind of numbers. Now going back though, there are a couple things where like looking at it, they were, I would say maybe a hair surprising. Right. And so, for example, again, this is strictly the data, right? Like if I just looked at the data, I'd say like, hey, look, I'm really happy with a lot of these things. But this call down here, Gorilla, is a play that, like, look on paper from an analytics perspective, like it looks good. It fits. You're getting 6.3 yards per call, so that's the good and the bad. It had more yards than it was called from a totality. But it surprised me. So I went back on film and was wondering, okay, like, why was this so good? Like, why didn't I call this more? Right. And then you go back and realize basically all of those calls were us not executing the play maybe as well as we could, but throwing to a hyper talented kid that made it happen. And so, it was a play where like, hey, how you draw it up is one way, how we executed it was an entirely different way. And then it happened to be a deal where that kid was graduating, right? And so we weren't going to have that player back anymore. And so now you're saying to yourself, like, okay, is that play worth it to keep in the offense, where the only reason it was good is because one player did a phenomenal job, with the ball in his hands. But in terms of looking things and saying like, did I call it, too much or not enough? I think the biggest tell to me is just, was it efficient? Right. Like, and again, efficiency can mean a bunch of things to a bunch of different people. But if we're talking, big picture, the biggest picture we can look at, I kind of look at the percent called and percent of yards. As long as those are close, I think it probably fits in right about where you want it to be, offensively. And then a lot of these calls too, where they were only called a couple times. I mean, some of these were like very specific calls. Some of these are calls where we kind of force things. You can see Hail Mary we called one time. Our hook and ladder we called twice.
That's and the
so
one I want to see.
And so some of these things, they only get called a couple times, but they're also very, very specific maybe the game plan. They were very specific, you know, for a personnel grouping that we carried that week or whatever. And so I kind of start everything right here looking at the top. And then again, just going back to the minimum effective dose, right? And so 83% of our total yards on offense came from these top 10 plays. Okay. And now you're talking about like, look, even if I cut out the one play saying, hey, that was made go by, you know, one or two really good athletes, you're still talking about over 80% of our offense now came from 9 different play calls.
Yeah.
And so I think when you're able to kind of look at it like that, you can say to yourself, hey, if we can get really, 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 really good at executing these 9 things, then we've got a chance week in, week out to have a chance to be pretty good. Because a lot of it was, look, you know, the tempo we kind of played with there, and the way we were able to execute, like we were able to run those plays faster than other teams were able to defend them at times, and we were able to execute them, you know, at a pretty decent level as well.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. I mean, when you look at it, and coaches, you know, we all love to do the complex thing. We love to complicate it. We love to tag and do all these other things and this and that. But at the end of the day, this is why self-scouting is so important. You look back at it, you're like, look, if we don't do these 9 things right, that's 80% of our offense. So if we're not focusing on this, are we really only getting better at 20% of what we do? And that's not the direction you want to go in that way.
Aaron, I got to be honest, as a football coach, math teacher, you got me going right now. I love this. What have you noticed? What stood out to you since you started doing this? Have there been any surprises or anything you look back on and gone, why did we do this?
I think the number one thing that stood out to me, like as soon as I did this, was less is more, right? Like, what do you need to carry to get done what you need to do? Okay. And so I think, you know, kind of prior to doing this, I definitely was way more open to carry a lot more. And right now we carry a lot, but I'm less like, I've got hyper intelligent kids that are unbelievably savvy, unbelievably sharp. And so we carry a lot right now. But I think the number one thing that came out of this particular kind of study was like, hey, look, like if we could only run 9 things, like we'd be okay. We'd have a shot to be pretty good. And especially too, when you start looking at, hey, what happens if we get, you know, a couple % better at those 9 and then we cut out some of these bad plays, right? Like if we can cut out some of these bad plays and get a little bit better at our good plays, then now, you know, you don't have to carry quite as much. Now, you know, make sure you've got answers to problems, right? Like you can't say like, oh, we're just going to keep cutting things until we've only run, you know, X amount. Like you got to have answers. And that's what some of these things down here are, right? And so Robber for us, you know, 22 yards a call, like that's pretty good. Robber for us was a double move off of, it was a double move off of deep choice. Okay. So it should hit for quite a bit. You know, and so when you start looking at a couple of those things that, hey, look, yeah, it looks really good maybe on paper, but it's not an every down deal. We can't sit and call double move off deep choice every play and kind of hope for the best. And so I think that going back, like the number one thing is just less is more sometimes, right?
No, I think that's a good point. Again, less is more not only applies to us, but it definitely applies to our kids. You know, a lot of times we forget that we're coaching 15 to 18-year-old kids. There's a lot going on in their lives that they feel like are important, and there's a lot of things they're going to forget. So less is more is probably a great piece of advice for coaches everywhere. So coach, all right, you're done with this. You've fixed up Huddle. You've got your sheet. You've got all this data. What is the next step that you're going to take in the off season?
Yeah, so I think for me, and kind of one of the things that we do is, okay, we got kind of the information. We know what we were good at. We know what we were, you know, maybe didn't execute, or maybe, you know, frankly, like was not called at the right time. And so we kind of know where we stand. And so the question then becomes, all right, what do we need to do in terms of changing? Is there something that we need to say, like, hey, look, like this really doesn't have a place in the offense as like a core call. Let's cut it. Or, hey, look, we're lacking in this area, right? Like we don't have a really good way to do blank in the offense. So from there, looking at specifically, like, what do we need to add? What do we need to remove? And then kind of the next thing I do after that is who runs stuff similar enough to us that might run into some of the same problems as us to go study. In this area, we've got some really high level high school football being played. And so I know, there's some coaches in the area that I feel really good about trying to talk to about certain things. So maybe sometimes getting the answer is locally. Sometimes getting the answer is looking at college film. Every year I kind of pick a team to learn more about, somebody that does, again, something similar enough to us. So that way you can see things like, hey, look, we do that. We do something very similar to that. That way, hey, look, they probably are going to run into some of the same issues. How do they defeat this? And so I just start going into like study mode, right? Like seek out who does something that we might steal as an answer for us, and then study it up, try to get as many clips of it as possible. There's so much on the internet now that you can get a lot from places. So in terms of all 22 film, like I've already got most of what I need already from this past season, and the bowl games haven't been played yet, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where I go from there. Is okay, like what is it that we need to tweak in our game? And maybe sometimes it's like, hey, look, we've got this super star player at this position. Like how can we best highlight that player, right? Like right now, we've got a couple of phenomenal receivers that are unbelievably hardworking, super savvy, make a bunch of plays, like trying to make sure we're putting them in a position to do what they do best.
Yeah, no doubt. Do me a favor and share that screen real quick, just so we can get everybody's bright face back up on the board. So that's a good point, Coach. You brought up a couple different things, and that was going out and seeking information. And then the other one was finding film. So we know there's varying ways to do both. For people out there, where do you kind of start? Are you a clinic guy? Are you a go to a college guy? Are you a hit someone up on Twitter guy? Like, what is your go-to?
I would say kind of all the above. So like my default number one go-to is I've got so many random, like I know you too, like I'm on so many random Google Drives, right? That typically I can just type in my Google Drive search bar and find a bunch of what I need. Other than that, I still like going to clinics. I feel like their popularity has kind of dwindled. I still like going, part of that, I like the camaraderie. I like seeing guys that, I might only get to see a couple times that I've known for a while. But part of it there is, there's a bunch of coaches that give out really good information. And then, the other thing, the nice thing about some of them is you get access to some of their online libraries of videos. And so we can, watch those. There's enough podcasts out there, books. I mean, whatever the information I need, like I try to find it, and wherever it is, like go get it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I tell people a lot. I've learned more off of Twitter as a coach than I think I have in a lot of places. I've done it all. I've bought books, I've been on Twitter, I've been on YouTube, I've talked to coaches, I've been to colleges. I've learned more like you said, the fixers for things from college coaches, but general football, I've learned so much from the internet and Twitter and all that stuff. If I'm looking for a specific solution to something, I'm going to go to a college coach. If I'm looking for how to play quarters defense, I'm going to Cody Alexander or one of those guys on Twitter.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's Like most offensive coaches, I've taken a real deep dive on Tennessee's offense, and just
Yeah.
the one or two practices I went to at USF this past spring kind of opened my eyes. Like, man, I thought I was close on some things, how they do some stuff, and it was like, okay, like, all right, now I feel like I've got, a couple more of the answers. And they don't always share everything, but they try to get you where you want to be, when you ask questions. And so most of the time you can go to those guys and say, hey, look, here's my problem, and talk to them about it, or something super specific to their offense. I know a couple years back I went to a college, and it was a team we were studying, and they had a very specific like fourth down package. Like they lined up in quads, and it was a bunch of Q run game and just various things going on. And I asked a question about it, and they were kind of like, okay, how do you know, how would you know that? But then, they jumped into it. Like, look, here's exactly what we do out of that package, and then.
Sorry, it's funny you say that, because I can think of the specific college you're talking about, and I hate them. So
Yeah.
I think I'm on the right path here, but I remember I'm like,
probably.
every time they're in quads, here comes Q run. But go
Yeah.
ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Yeah, and then some coaches, they light up when you ask them like really specific questions. Like all the big time college coaches, they do the clinics, right? Like let's talk about inside zone, let's talk about culture, let's talk about this, and right when Norvell got to FSU, but right before COVID hit, they held some kind of chalk talk sessions, and just like asking super specific situational stuff. Like Mike Norvell and Kenny Dillingham at the time, like they just light up. Like, oh man, yeah. let's talk third and long. Like they'll answer all the RPO questions and all that. But if you can ask them super specific stuff, like typically like not getting the nitty gritty of ball, like they'll really light up and get going.
Coach, I listened to Kenny Dillingham talk about Y cross for 41 minutes. I timed it. 41 straight minutes, one play.
Yeah,
and
he's sharp.
It's one of the best offensive things I've heard, because it's all garbage, but they want to do that. But no, it's really funny, like you said, getting specific. I can remember, I'm with actually our next guest that you'll see on the podcast. I was with Coach McIntyre, and Pete Golding, when he was the DC at Alabama, was doing kind of one of those things where you could text in questions and they were covering them like on a live video. Well, I may or may not know a couple GAs at Bama, and I was like, hey, look, I need the inside track on my questions. And they were like, yeah, just feed them to us. And so that was the year that they had just whipped Ohio State. Was it a national title they beat Ohio State? It was one of those. And they just absolutely murdered them. And they were running a very specific drop 8 coverage. And I'm not a drop 8 guy. So I was like, hey, what are you guys doing here? And we basically rigged it where like our first 5 or 6 questions were the ones that we were getting out of Coach on the thing. But it was because we asked very specific questions. I think Coach got really fired up about answering them. Right? It wasn't like, hey, Coach, like, what are you doing in your odd package? Right? It was like, hey, Coach, I saw you do this drop 8 against Ohio State, and it was successful. What was the coverage into the boundary, and how do you call it to the field? And he was like, oh, that's great. It's cut into the boundary. It's ripples to the field. And I'm like, oh, that makes perfect sense. And so all those coaches want super specific questions. And we all know you can go out and find their playbooks. And then when you just don't know something, try to figure out a way to pose a question for it, because we've all done the game. Every person that I'm, between the two of you and me, where we've had a playbook and we're having to like piece together what everything means. Cause they don't actually write what everything has. Right. And Saban's, it's forever. I'm like, what is clamp? I don't know what clamp is. And finally I got somebody on the phone. I was like, hey, what is clamp? They're like, it's palms, dude. I'm like, oh. Like all this time I'm thinking clamp is something different. It's frickin' palms. I've been running that for 6 years. So it's really cool going out and doing those things. The clinics, Coach Avery, I'm with you. I still think the best conversations in clinics happen after everything's done, and you find a couple coaches, and maybe you find a room or you're at a table at the bar and you start writing on the napkins, right? That's when all the good stuff comes out. I've seen more great things on napkins, I think, that I have on whiteboards at clinics. Matt, with the exception of the lizard, that's the greatest thing we've ever seen.
Lizard King. Yeah.
It was Avery. If you don't know, they were doing a board, whatever war thing between two guys. And this guy like wouldn't let the other guy even go. And he's like, see, you're going to go here, but look, I'm going to come out. I'm going to run the lizard formation. Do you know what that is? And the guy's like, no. And he draws up like unbalanced. And he goes, but you think you're going to do this, but I'm going to shift all these guys over, and would like never let the defensive guy talk. And we were in the background just rolling.
By the time he was done with it, he shifted every player over and ran sweep to the edge, and he won with the quarterback sweep.
Yeah, and the defensive guy was just like, you win.
Hey, Coach, how much do you usually look to pull from the offseason? You go, maybe you learn something new. Do you have any moments like that where, hey, this is a new thing we need to implement, maybe 2 or 3 things to your offense? What are you looking to get out of it that way?
Yeah, again, like try to approach it, or I try to approach it with very specific needs that get filled. So like that's number one, right? Is like I'm trying to get specific needs filled. If I can't get those filled, how practice, right? Like how you practice and things like that, I think are a big deal. And so like sometimes like that'll just fall in my lap, right? And then you'll be like, whoa, this is awesome. And so like there's definitely things that just kind of randomly were talked about this past clinic season of how teams do practice. And I'm like, hey, look, I wasn't necessarily looking for this, but this fits us offensively. This already fits our practice schedule. Like this is something that is really cheap and easy for us to kind of do in practice. And so anytime I find anything that's, hey, look, I wasn't looking for that, but it fits us, like, and we can use it, like I'll steal it and use it for sure.
Now, kind of go further what Matt said, when you're out there looking for those answers, is it typically to something that maybe was tough for you to see that year, like some kind of front or some kind of defense where you're like, oh God, we got to go find an answer to this?
So, so it'll be multiple things, right? Like, hey, everybody a couple years ago, everybody wants to be in tight front. And so, all right, what's everybody doing against tight front? Okay. Hey, everybody's trying to do this from a coverage perspective. Okay. What are people doing to beat that? The other thing that I try to look at kind of every season as well is like just situational football, right? And so one of the things that you see is a lot of people having very similar red zone plans, and teams that are really good situationally, right? And so you can go on, I mean, all the statistics are all over the internet. I can go and find like statistically who are the best teams in the red zone. All right, let's go start checking them out. And so maybe it's a deal where, hey, look, we need better red zone throws inside the 5. I know a couple years ago it was like, hey, look, I needed better high red zone answers. And so we adopted it and went. And then again, talking about things just falling in your lap, like this past offseason, had a couple of just red zone wrinkles fall into my lap that like, hey, look, that's extremely similar to something we already do. That would just be one tag to one guy.
Yeah.
And we ran them this year with success. I mean, we had a game this year where I had to call almost every kind of red zone pass I had. But the part of the reason we were able to kind of have a deep catalog is that, just stumbled upon these plays that, a guy was like, hey, we do this. And I was like, oh, we do that. And he goes, well, then do you do this? I was like, nope, but we do now, and so just
such
things
a great
like that.
answer.
Yeah, I mean, things like that just kind of fall in your lap, right? And so I think every coach is trying to get better situationally. Every coach is trying to get better, at practice. And so those things for sure.
So you don't have to like reveal exactly who it was, but where did you get that? Like, what was the general thing? Was it out of college? Was it at a clinic? Was it on the phone, Twitter?
Yeah. So yeah, it was college coaches.
Gotcha. You don't have to specify.
Yeah, it's college coaches.
The secretive nature, I understand. Well, that's great. So we've been through it. You talk about the adjustments and stuff. And then the last thing is, outside of the pure X's and O's, and we kind of talked about a little bit, but that feedback loop with your players and drills and things like that, you kind of talked to me about it earlier. Why don't you go ahead and talk to our listeners about that as well?
Yeah, so I really like getting feedback from players about practice, right? And so I like to know kind of like, hey, what was your favorite indie drill? What was your least favorite indie drill? What was your favorite group drill? What was your least favorite group drill? Like what part of practice, like maybe there's a transition that we can ease, or a transition that we can speed up. I like getting feedback from them on that. Like, and then specific quarterback, I like talking to them about coming out of spring, I usually always ask like, hey, what was your favorite play this spring? What was your least favorite play? Why? And so, schematically, I get feedback from them, I especially want to know the things they feel best about. Like if I can only call one play, like what is it, right? Like what do you feel so good about that you're just like, Coach, look, call this every time, I'm good. And then what is it where if I call it, you're like, hey, Coach, look, it's kind of sketchy, I'd rather not, and so those I definitely want to know. But I really like getting the feedback on practice. Cause I mean, we had a drill we did last year, and the feedback after the season was almost all the quarterbacks were kind of like, it wasn't really my favorite thing to do. And so we didn't do it this year, and just said like, all right, cool. No problem. If it's something that you guys don't feel strong, it's something that I liked, right? And it's something that I think, as coaches, you sit there and say, hey, yeah, this is a good drill. Like we're incorporating quarterbacks and receivers and the tight ends. Like this is a good drill, and the quarterbacks but it was primarily for the quarterbacks, right? Like, and if they didn't feel like they were getting a whole lot out of it, then hey, look, I don't necessarily know that we need to be doing it.
How much do you iterate? Speaking of drills, like how much do you iterate on drills? I know we've talked about this a lot. How many times a year, or is it every other year or something, that you go back and you really analyze your drill and be like, why are we doing this? Like what, is this positive? Is this a thing that we want to continue to do? Do you spend time with the other coaches going through that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really lucky in terms of like the other coaches that I coach with are all unbelievably high level coaches, right?
Yeah,
that,
you have dudes on staff. You guys are
they
lucky.
don't right. And so I mean, and most of them have forgotten more football than I know. And so, our offensive line coach is obviously in my opinion, the best offensive line coach. Like he's unbelievable. Like
not to cut you off here, but Matt, Aaron has gone ahead and RSVP'd him to do a talk with you where you two just talk offensive line the whole time. So he doesn't know it yet, but he's coming on the podcast, and it is an O-line episode. I'm literally going to hit record, do the intro, and I'm going to stop talking.
Let's do it.
Yeah. And so from that perspective, like our coaches, they coach. Like I don't really mess with any of that. Now we'll talk about group drills and maybe kind of what makes sense, like how can we pair some things together. But from an individual standpoint, like everybody is the captain of their own ship on our staff, and everybody does an unbelievable job with that.
Yeah, I think that was a big thing that you talked about picking up from one of those coaches, but it was right that you only wanted to do so much indie, and then the rest of your indie you wanted to be paired with some other position group or something like that. Didn't you talk about that, Aaron?
Yeah, and so I know it was, not quite to that extreme, but like when Kevin Kelly was at Presbyterian or whatever, he was like, oh, we only practice all 11, right? And it's like, okay, hey, look, that makes a lot of sense. I don't necessarily know if you can do that. It's tough for sure, but it makes a lot of sense, and then shocker, the best clinic talk I heard this past offseason was Kirby Smart just talking about practice. It was an hour about practice, and it could have gone on for 4 hours, and I would have been like, this is the most unbelievable.
In, right?
Yeah, and look, I mean, it's not a surprise they're as good as they are. Like he everything he talked about was like, look, we want to be the best practicing team in America, and he talked about how they do it, and you're just like, yep, that checks out. That makes sense, And
Turns
so I
out
think
you're still good, coach, in the middle of a 29-game win streak.
Yeah, and so I think we try to use the times of the year too to influence what's going on, right? Like, and so in spring, quarterbacks need a lot more indie work, right? Especially some of those younger guys you're preparing to get ready, whatever it might be. And so, hey, I'm a little bit more open for them to be by themselves. But then kind of once we get in the fall, especially once fall gets going, like, I mean, the amount of time late in the season where our quarterbacks are by themselves is very, very small. They need to be working, with the backs. They need to be working with the tight ends. They need to be working with the receivers. They need to be doing, inside run, working on their reads, and so I think quarterbacks, especially from an offense perspective, like trying to pair them up with other groups. And then, again, like tight ends need the O-line to work run blocking. Running backs need the quarterbacks. They need the O-line, the tight ends. Receivers would rather have the quarterback throw them the ball than a coach. And so just trying to find creative ways to pair all those up. maximum benefit, for the kids, not just from maybe a schematical perspective, but just from like a logistical perspective too. Like if we can have quarterbacks throw in these drills and speed up the drills,
Yeah. You mean old Coach Avery and back there firing the football?
Every once in a while I got to, and then my arm is sore the next day. But then I'll throw a good one, and the kids are like, "Whoa, look at that!"
It's like I got once every 10, guys. That's it.
Yeah.
So going past all this, and this has been phenomenal stuff. Do you do any like off-season coaching specifically with quarterbacks, or do you give them any kind of film to look at or anything like that? Is there any kind of just like general football knowledge teaching that you do with those guys in any form or fashion?
From a football IQ perspective, I really don't. It's part of the reason. There's a couple reasons for it. Like I every year I go back and forth. Like I really should do this. I really should do that. But my theory is a couple things. Like like kids need to be kids, right? Like the season's a grind. I mentioned that to one of my coworkers on Monday. Monday was the first day I didn't have anything to do after school since school started, right? And so like it's the same way for the kids. And so kind of let the kids be kids a little bit. And then for us, we've got a lot of kids that play other sports. And so our quarterbacks the last couple of years have been high-level baseball players. At Oakleaf, our quarterback was a superstar soccer player. And so kind of let them go to the other sport, right? And then for our guys, like we're kind of lucky. Our defensive staff does a really good job. And so our guys see so many different looks in season that we're able to talk through and they're able to digest that, they get so much football IQ in the fall and in the spring, seeing it live, that they don't necessarily need a whole lot of like football theory. And so, I try not to put the extra load on the players if I don't have to. I would always be willing if a player was like, "Hey, look, I want to learn about this for sure."
Yeah.
But I think that sometimes it's important for them to check out of football for a little bit, and go be a kid.
Feed the cats thing, right? You got to have an off season, got to have rest time, all the good stuff. So
yeah,
something we talk quite a bit about. I can't wait till we have that episode. So you and I can just beat down Matt with feed the cats stuff. Maybe we'll just like beg Tony Holler to come on. He probably won't. He'll be like, "Who's listening to this?" And I'll be like, "There's like 7 people."
Just going back to the football IQ thing, the only thing I've considered doing like the last couple of years, I don't remember who I heard talk about it, but I really like it, is either go back and just like rewatch your whole season with them play by play, like everything, and maybe it's a deal where like, hey, look, here are the run plays. Here's why we called this run play. Here's what happened. Like rewatch your games clip by clip with them, but not from a like, hey, I'm trying to correct you on this play perspective, but hey, look, like here's offensively what's going on. Here's what's going on defensively. Or the other one is very similar to that. Finding a college team that does something similar, right?
Yeah.
And say, hey, we're going to watch this team. But as we watch the clips, I want you to translate what you think they're doing in our verbiage, right? And so like, hey, here is this team running this play. Like, what do you think we would call that? And just kind of give them a little bit more ownership from that regard. And then, kids, if they can go watch highlights of some of these college guys, like they might be a little bit more willing to watch it.
So that's something that I've implemented before, and it works phenomenally with kids that are interested in college football, interested in the pros. They'll take a look at it, and then you'll find them doing it on their own and writing down stuff on their own, plays that they see as highlights or something. They're going to go try to figure out what we would call it, and they'll bring it to you in paper.
Oh, yeah.
I've had kids walk up with a piece of paper. Here, coach, look, this Georgia did it. Exactly what our assistant coaches would come. They'd come with the same paper.
Yeah.
Hey, Georgia did this weekend. Can we take a look at doing this, coach? But it's drawn up in our terminology, and it shows that the kids have a greater understanding of what you're doing.
We did it as well during the offseason with defensive guys. We do the same thing on all 22 and just show them things like, hey, here's a great, and we got super, like we always said, like it's no more than 20 minutes. And maybe it's just a whole cut up on the DN spilling the puller. It's like, look, Go watch Alabama and watch this guy spill it and spill it and spill it and spill it. All right, what's your excuse for not spilling? Like, why do you think you're too good to do this or that? And the kids kind of look at him. I'm like, all right, if the D end at Alabama is willing to spill it, not make the tackle and spill it to the backer, shouldn't you be? And that was always good because our kids got to see that. They were interested in watching film, right? It wasn't another high school team. It was Alabama, right? It was Georgia. It was whoever you want to pick. So that became really valuable. All right, Coach. So we always wrap everything up with the same question. I think you know it, but we're going to ask it anyways. What's one thing you or Bolles does that's unique or better than everyone else that you can share with us?
I
love putting people on the spot.
No pressure. No pressure.
This is our favorite part of the podcast right here.
We have special kids, you know. I mean, the school day for them is grueling enough, right? And so for our kids to do what they do in the classroom day in, day out, then to turn around and do what they do on the football day and, you know, on the football field day in, day out, and you know, perform at the level they do. I mean, it's impressive. You know, our kids take the hard classes. You know, I mean, they've got a hard schedule, and it's tough. You know, and so I think that, you know, what we do well is and what kind of makes us different is our kids are, the capacity for getting things done is unbelievably high for our kids. And then going back to what I said earlier, you know, we carry a lot. We carry a lot on offense. You know, we carry a good amount on defense. And so, I mean, you're talking about our kids have to know, you know, all these super high level math classes. They're in, you know, Chinese class. They're in all these classes. Coach. Yeah. I mean, they're in unbelievably like tough academic classes. Then they have to turn around and they know, you know, our offense, they have to know our offense and defense inside and out. You know, we move guys around. It's challenging, and they answer the bell. And so I think that's what kind of makes us is that we have really special kids that are able to, you know, overcome, learn, keep rolling, keep getting better, you know, and that's kind of us. That's our shtick.
No doubt. I would definitely use the term resilient. For those of you listening, if you're not from the Florida area, Bolles High School is kind of a staple of North Florida. As much as it pains me to say, being a Bishop Kenny graduate, Bolles is always in the mix. They, you know, you guys started 0-3 this year and then went on a run all the way to the Final Four. And right, the 3 teams you lost to, Coach, are like still playing, correct?
4 teams we lost to in the regular season are playing for a state championship this week.
All playing for a state championship. 3 in Florida and 1 in Georgia, correct?
Yes.
So, I mean, the resiliency, like you said, to go and play that kind of level talent and to start 0-3 and bounce back, you know, right? There was every reason in the world for you guys to phone it in for the year, and instead you end up in a state semifinal game. It's pretty darn impressive. Yeah, Matt, you got any other closing questions for Coach Avery, and we'll do the wrap up here?
No, I mean, it really made me question what I used to do in the off season the way I broke down film, but I love it. I love the data, everything you guys are doing up there. Obviously, you guys are kicking butt, and it's because of that and the work you guys are putting in. So it's absolutely great stuff, and glad you were able to come on today.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, Coach Avery, we appreciate having you on. Again, if you're listening, you can reach out to us at the Board Drill Podcast at gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter at Board Drill Pod. And ask us anything you want. If you have any questions for Coach, we can definitely get some questions over to him. If you have any topics you'd like us to talk about, or if you're interested in being a guest on the show, reach out and let us know. We're happy to interact with you and talk with you. And, you know, while you're at it, why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and follow us every week and listen to the podcast. So thanks again, everyone listening. Coach Dixon, Coach Avery, thanks for coming on. It's such a pleasure to have you both. You're 2 of my closest friends, and it's always good to chat with the both of you.